This podcast was recorded in the podcast studio at the Great Room Afro Asia in Singapore. Welcome to Greater Encounters by the Great Room, the podcast series where great minds meet and where curiosity meets knowledge. Let's dive right in.
Welcome, listeners, to Greater Encounters, where great minds meet and where curiosity meets knowledge. I'm your guest host for the day, David Isaac Matthews, Principal of Growth Advisory and Corporate Venture Building at Causality. Joining us today at the Great Room Afro Asia's podcast room is Conall McDevitt, the Managing Partner, Europe and Asia of the Penta Group. With over 2 decades of experience in strategic communications, politics, and public affairs spanning Europe, Asia, and North America, Conall brings a wealth of insights to our discussion, and we'll talk about how we're going to be bringing digital transformation to reputation risk management, or if I'm overselling, the potential of taking care of some of the biggest companies in the world today. Today, we're going to dive deep into that realm and the role of perhaps AI, corporate governance, geopolitical risk, and the future of the structure of an organization down to organizational dynamics. Conall, I'd love for you to introduce a little bit of the things that matter to you. Tell us a little bit about yourself, and then we're going to go into a little bit of an icebreaker for the audience to get to know you better with one of these amazing, great room, honest conversation starter cards.
So my name is Connell. I am a cisgendered, white, privileged, middle-aged, straight male. And I am now in my 50s, so I think it's probably actually 3 decades of experience and not 2, although I'm happy for that to remain on the website. I am Irish, from an amazing city called Dublin, but I grew up in the south of Spain, so I kind of feel very strongly about concepts of identity and diversity and people understanding and exploring their own identity. We don't necessarily need to define ourselves just from the place whose passport we hold, for example. And I think that's particularly pertinent debate here in a great place like Singapore, where identity and national identity and tradition and culture is interlinked and so on and so forth. And I've spent most of my adult life living in another great city, a very small city called Belfast. And the reason I ended up there was I had the great privilege of being a very, very minor participant in the peace process in the late 90s. So I have 3 kids and they are all now adults. So my children are not children.
And just from that introduction, we can see that today is going to be a very broad-ranging, yet very deep and thoughtful conversation covering the interrelations between quite a few topics. And I'm quite excited to be here today. I'm going to give you this deck, and we shortlisted, and this is a surprise question, and I'm going to let you read the question that's been selected for you.
So the question is, who is your mentor and what have you learnt from them? So I'm going to pick a gentleman who's no longer with us. He's unfortunately dead, and his name was John Hume. And John Hume was a man from a city called Derry. You may have seen Derry Girls on the TV. It might have reached Singapore. And if you haven't, go on one of the platforms like Netflix or Amazon and find it. Because it is the story of a bunch of teenage girls in the mid-1990s, just at the time of the IRA ceasefire in Northern Ireland and the birth of the peace process in Derry. And that was John's hometown. In fact, he makes a cameo in Derry Girls on the TV. And Hume was born into poverty in the late 30s. He experienced huge discrimination, sectarian discrimination. At the time Singapore was born, in the middle of the 1960s, he was just graduating from university as a teacher. And he was returning to his home, and he was realizing that the kids he was teaching were so poor that they would really struggle to take advantage of the education that the state was providing them. Housing was terrible, inequality was rife. There was heavy discrimination, and this motivated him to get into politics. And he started a career which was inspired by the civil rights movement that was taking place in the United States of America at the time. People like Martin Luther King. And his basic premise was that in order to be able to find a prosperous opportunity for, in his case, initially just the people of Derry, but it became the people of Ireland. We needed to understand that the divisions that existed between us were not about lines on maps, but they were about divisions in our head. They were about the prejudices that we all hold. And Hume speak is a thing that if you grew up in Ireland, you understand. And he coined several amazing phrases to explain the futility of getting distracted by things that are much less important than our common humanity. And a couple of them that I think are really relevant and are globally relevant are these. The first one is that you are an accident of your birth. The only thing that you didn't choose to do as a human was be born. You had no choice. You could have been born into a particular faith group or ethnicity or skin color or identity or place or social strata. And that was just the way it was. But everything after then, in this world we live in today, should be about your potential and opportunity. So whilst your birth is an accident, you must have the agency and the freedom to be able to fill your potential as a human being, irrespective of the circumstances of your birth. And that's a beautifully inspirational thing. And he started talking about this in the 60s when that was not a given. It was just not accepted. The other thing he used to always say is that you can't eat a flag. And that whilst, having a national identity is very important and feeling very proud about your national identity, the thing that's going to put bread and butter on the table is not just a blind commitment to nationalism. It is a commitment to people and to society and to enterprise. And finally, he used to adopt a phrase that was used in the States as well very often, which is that, if you're in a society which is riven by conflict, as this society was at the time, nothing really stops a bullet like a job. In other words, if you want to transform a society, create economic prosperity. And when you're here in Singapore and you're of my generation, I was born in the early 70s, I think every time I come, I'm reminded of the fact that nothing transforms a society like economic prosperity. And the great gift Singapore provides to us all around the world is the example of how a nation can be born in a very, very extreme and difficult circumstance, and through sheer commitment to enterprise. And, I hope you don't mind me saying it, by just hustling on the global stage, transform itself into one of the great examples of open, knowledge-based economies in the world. And so Hume is my inspiration. He goes on to deliver peace in Ireland. He wins the Nobel Peace Prize. He is the only man in history to have won the Nobel Peace Prize, the Mahatma Gandhi Peace Prize, and the Martin Luther King Peace Prize. And for 4 years, he was my boss. And everything I will ever do, I will do in homage to him and to try and support his legacy, but also because of the great gift he gave me. And the gift he gave me was a job to work with him. And it was amazing.
That is quite a heartfelt and thoughtful and inspiring and tear-jerking introduction. That is amazing. Quite a couple of sound bites there and an exceptional quote or two that I will take with me. Thank you for sharing those. And then we segue into the conversation. We're going to be covering governance and growth and downside protection and geopolitical and possibly technology risks. We're going to take this first principles and systems thinking approach that you've probably fine-tuned across so many different parts of your experience. And then we're probably going to go into talking about how a new company like Penta can protect significant economic value because you're unlocking barriers to growth as well as providing downside protection with this new angle to the digital transformation of an otherwise rather traditional industry. Do you want to tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, so we come from a very traditional industry. It's the public relations, government relations, regulatory affairs, investor relations industry. And the model of professional services firms, consultancies in our industry has always been purely advisory. So people like me who had the great privilege of having careers in politics and government would join this industry after retiring from public service, and you would take your expertise and you would take your knowledge and you would apply it to corporate strategy and international business strategy. And my colleagues are around the world are others who have served in great offices of state. It's very lovely to have colleagues who have been in the White House, colleagues who have served in government, colleagues who have been senior editors in newspapers, colleagues who have been chief communications officers for some of the largest firms in the world. But the problem with that model is that you're only as good as the experience of the individuals you happen to have in the book on every given day of the week. There is an extreme limitation to your ability to be able to navigate the highly disrupted, data-rich environment in which we're operating. And so the thesis behind Penta is to take a traditional advisory platform and to integrate it with an intelligence-led series of capabilities. And so in our business, those come in 3 different shapes. The first is a very significant metadata set, which we use to be able to monitor the world's media and social media, to be able to calculate sentiment and reputation scores, and to be able to identify correlations between reputation, sentiment, and things like share price or other things. And alongside that, there are 2 research capabilities, and then there's also a predictive analytical capability where we can look at the metadata and the research, and we can begin to surface issues that may become significant things, conversations, issues in the next 3 to 6 months. We're also the only firm in the world that researches longitudinally the policymaking communities in DC and Brussels. So that's very interesting because we're uniquely able to offer you an insight over the past decade and looking into the future as to what policymakers, so members of Congress, administration, etc. in DC and the European Parliament, the Council, the Commission in Brussels, think about some of the world's largest firms, about some of the big sectors, global sectors, about some of the regulatory challenges and some geopolitical things as well.
I think that's very sophisticated because in the 3 types of analytics, from prescriptive to descriptive to predictive, you're being very ambitious with the kind of information and insight to possibly be helping your clients who are, we count governments and large corporations and possibly even very large privately owned enterprises.
Correct. Yeah.
The ability to prioritize and sequence where they need to go or don't go, and when they need to wait for more information, but you're giving them a broader set of data that they can use to be more data driven in their leadership. And that's very interesting. Correct. Knowing what you know, are you living your job? Like, do we need to be living in fear day to day?
No. I mean, there's 2 answers to that question. One's a very sort of, I guess, a very technical answer, and the other's a philosophical answer. I mean, let me deal with the philosophical first, okay? As a species, I don't take a Hobbesian view of humanity. I don't believe that our existence is nasty, brutish, and short. I believe that if you look back at us as a species, despite our best efforts to fall out with each other, we have a huge commitment to our survival. And therefore, we ultimately appear as a species to be hardwired towards coexistence and survival rather than mutual destruction and elimination. I was watching on the flight over, I was watching Oppenheimer, the film. I hadn't had a chance to watch it. My youngest son is really ambitious to study film next year when he finishes his A-levels, and he had told me, Dad, this is an amazing film. And he said, but you forget about the film bit because you're not really interested in that. It's just an incredible story. And of course, if anyone's watched it, they'll be reminded of the fact that the character is dealing with 2 things in his head as he is essentially leading the project that will build the nuclear bomb. That will be a weapon of mass destruction that will destroy 2 cities in Japan, and that will, quote unquote, end the Second World War. But one of the projects in his head was just a conceptual scientific one, and the other was a consequential sociological political one. And those 2 things were happening in parallel within this great mind, right? And he was aware of that. And of course, immediately after it happened, he realized that, to use the famous quote from Oppenheimer, the United States and the communist bloc as it was then will be like two scorpions fighting in a sealed jar. The concept of mutually assured destruction was now amongst us. And what I'm trying to say in a very long-winded way is that you can take a dystopian view of humanity. You can take the view that things are terrible, that we are on a path to destruction, but history suggests otherwise. History suggests that actually every time we meet a technology that could have the power to do terrible things to us, we go close to letting it doing that, pull back, because we understand that our survival as a species trumps everything. And so when I think about like what we're going to talk about hopefully in the next few minutes, the whole challenge, opportunity and threat presented by artificial intelligence, I think exactly the same way. And what I also understand is that the way we talk about these threats globally today is a much more enlightened and much more open discussion than what we were able to have, for example, in the early 1940s, whenever the Manhattan Project was, unfolding itself in the deserts of New Mexico.
And to go from that, how do you preface these conversations with your client or potential clients? Do you approach it from the perspective that understanding reputational risk, where you can go, where you cannot go, unlocks new growth or protects downside? Or like Oppenheimer, we have two complex concepts in our mind at the same time.
I think it's exactly that. It's both, right? So, all organizations live with a degree of risk. And some of that risk is reputational. Some is not. Some is of a different characteristic, which may never have a reputational dimension to it. But some of it is of a reputational nature. And organizations historically have dealt with reputational crisis reactively, despite the fact that nearly every crisis of a reputational nature that an organization will meet is predictable. And that's one of the things that I think we should be thinking about in the context of AI and data. Nearly every crisis that an organization will meet from a reputational point of view is predictable. Not everyone. If you were a tech company, would you have modeled out the scenario for a global pandemic and sending all your people? No, you wouldn't have.
The black swan.
There's always one or two of them, right? But they are the minority of scenarios that you need to prepare for. Yet it is the case that most organizations think about reputational crisis as the reactive crisis. In other words, something you stand up a team in an emergency mode and you send them out to essentially fight the fire. And that there is both expensive, inefficient, and it's illogical, particularly if it was predictable. And invariably there's an inquiry or a debrief or some sort of review. And about 6 months later, they realized, actually, we knew about this for 3 months and we just, forgot to tell someone, or we didn't tell someone, or the information wasn't captured. And so when I think about this moment in history and in technological development, and I think about, the opportunity that AI presents for the organization from a risk point of view, the first opportunity is it should, if done and used well, allow organizations to surface risk much more quickly. But of course, it could also be the source of the organizational's risk. And, there's plenty we can talk about there. But at the most superficial level, if you're in business, no matter what you're selling, the first risk that AI will present to you is the risk of being impersonated, of being faked, of having some fraud committed. And the means or the cloak through which that fraud gets committed is something generated by artificial intelligence, right? And that is, of course, true. But that's always been true, in that, bad employees were also and remain a risk to fraudulent behavior. And, we simply develop rules and we develop procedures and we develop policies to prevent that sort of thing happening.
And that's where you're different from other players in the market. There are organizations that look at security and threat, and you look at it from an external perspective.
Yeah, we look at it, we actually look at it through what we call a stakeholder framework. And we think about 4 stakeholder groups. So if you imagine the organization, any organization, it will be surrounded by 4 groups that we see as the principal stakeholders. And we think that these 4 groups are the people who essentially shape and control the organization's reputation. The first group are its employees. If you work for an organization, you have a disproportionate impact on its reputation. I mean, if it's a service organization and you're the interface with the customers, if you're good, they like you, and if you're bad, your performance will impact on the reputation. The second group we think about is the investors or owners, because obviously the investors or owners have huge financial stake in the organization, and therefore they will impact on the organization's reputation, and they will be impacted by the organization's reputation. The third group we think about are its customers, because of course, the organization's customers are the people who pay the bills. They are the people who basically, in one way or another fund the organization because they buy its goods or services. And they too have a massive impact on its reputation and it on theirs. And then the last group, particularly in the bit of the kind of the world, the sort of the commercial world we operate, which is highly regulated, globalized industries, are the regulators and policymakers. Because they're making the rules that govern the organization. And that's increasingly so for so many sectors in which we operate. And the thing about those four groups is the way an organization traditionally has managed them is in silos. So you had a marketing department that managed the customer relations, and you have a HR department that manages the staff relations, and you'd have an investor relations team if you were a big organization, maybe a listed organization that would manage, relations with the markets or your investors. And then you might have like a public affairs team or a corporate communications, a corporate affairs team that would manage relations with your policy stakeholders. And our contention is that by doing that in an isolated way, you're actually creating four different risks. When in fact, they are all influencing each other and talking to each other, because in today's world with disintermediated information flows, it just flows around those stakeholder groups all day long, stuff around the organization. If an analyst on the investor side wants to know what's going on in the organization, they're as likely to go on Glassdoor these days and into LinkedIn to try and see if there's anything going on the HR side, as they are to, phone up the HR department and ask their opinion. They're as likely to look for data on what customers might be saying and how the organization is ranked from, if it is in that sort of industry where there's data available, and so on, so forth, right? So our contention is that when you think about an organization, its reputation, you need to think about it now at the C-suite level, because reputation has become intersectional. And you need to have an individual, either the CEO or the president, or in a very large organization, we would call it the chief stakeholder officer, whose duty it is to understand the totality of stakeholder relations and how they're interacting with each other. And to understand that, you need data. It's too much information to try and track without really good data. And to properly manage that data in 2024, you should lean into AI.
So there's a few threads to pull there, and a skeptical listener would have heard us move from talking about how risks are actually predictable versus the categorization of risks and how they're relevant to different possible stakeholder groups, and probably entities at different parts of their life cycle, mature and loved, or mature and becoming increasingly irrelevant. How do you tie these things together for somebody to take so many data points and contexts to give them a direction? So
if you're looking at it through a risk lens, okay, understanding the conversations that are taking place amongst your employee group, not in a kind of an invasive way, invading people's privacy, but like actually just listening to what they're saying. Maybe listening to what they're saying on social media, in forums, can oftentimes surface problems that the organization is either ignoring or denying.
Listening at scale is being used in retail.
Correct.
Companies like Shine are scraping Instagram photos and real-time producing products based on trends, getting customers to vote on those products before they build those products. So,
and in the marketing world, in the marketing world, this is just table stakes, as the Americans would say, right? But when you think about it from a corporate reputation point of view, the entire same techniques apply. And it is the same about the policymaker community. Oftentimes people get obsessed about like what the minister, the senior policymaker thinks, or what like the regulator at the, the central bank or at the monetary authority thinks if you're in the financial services sector. But you could actually have a problem that's been brewing in a parliamentary committee that you're ignoring because you don't think they're important.
And that brings me to the categories, right? Because when you said predictable and, with a skeptical lens, do you mean predictable that as in we can categorize different types of risks and therefore do scenario modeling on how to approach them depending on the degree of severity they manifest? Or are we talking about empowering leadership with possible, probable, imminent risk and therefore allowing them to take an almost statistically qualified set of next steps?
So it's actually both. We can obviously identify and categorize patterns. So you can begin, if you are interested enough to look at, are there patterns of conversations that are potentially risk generating, that would signal risk, that are just taking place either within a stakeholder group or between stakeholder groups. And if there are patterns, are there themes that emerge? And therefore, could we categorize, 3 or 4 or 10 different potential risk profiles? But the second point you made is also true in that, can you begin to identify emerging risks from within those companies? Of course you can. And can you anticipate risks that could become quite imminent? Yeah, you can. I mean, if a conversation has started off within a customer group around, I don't know, a bad product experience, and all of a sudden you notice that an analyst is talking about it and has picked up on it, well, you've got a problem. Because now 2 of your stakeholder groups are talking about it, your customers and your investors. And now if all of a sudden you realize that a couple of members of, some political entity, parliament, or, there's been a tweet put out by a regulatory authority to go, yeah, we're interested in this. You got a real problem. Now, if you look at the way many organizations would manage that today, they would actually manage it as 3 problems. And they might manage it as 3 small problems, when in fact what it is one emerging big reputational problem, which is about to hit the C-suite. And my argument in our thesis in Penta is, this is known knowns territory, to quote the famous saying, there's known knowns, known unknowns, and unknown unknowns. The first 2, today we have the technology to be able to understand what they are and get ahead of them. And as I said, there's a big difference between what 3 leaders in the business thinks is their small problem, and what the person above them, if they had the data, would go, no. This isn't 3 small problems. This is one emerging big problem.
So you're on the way to convincing me that the data is interpretable and trustworthy by enough of your clients. And the question then becomes, how are you looking at the reorganization of the operating models, the digital operating models that companies need to morph into to be able to take more agile and systematic action and really deliver value to the customer, perhaps as one of the primary stakeholders, or the people of the country for a government?
And this is where I think the conversation needs to move very quickly to, how does the organization at a strategic level use data in its management and governance? How does it think about being data-led in terms of its strategic decision-making? How much is it actually leaning into evidence bases to make decisions? And how much is it moving away from taking decisions, particularly in my world, in the reputation world, based solely on advice, which is another word for opinion, which is another word for bias, which is another word for walking, talking risk.
Wow. And when leading conversations with your clients, let's say they're an existing client and they might have a bias and they are resonating with the AI hype cycle, and that's almost drowning out the previous buzzwords of corporate phishing or espionage or external cybersecurity risks. How do you help them balance that conversation? Do you use the data to give them various sort of buckets of analysis and then bring them together, or do they decompose them and you bring the information in a bottom-up way? What do you see as being most enabling, as well as yet still building that trust in the data? Because there are 2 types of leadership: those that are extremely data-centric, maybe something in between
And I think when you think about it through our world, the world of reputation management, the corporate affairs leaders, the chief communications officer, chief corporate affairs officer, et cetera, they are unlikely to have lent in very heavily to data to date, even in very data-rich organizations. And what we're inviting them to do is to start gently. We don't want people to dive into the deep end of the pool and find themselves in trouble, but they should start gently. And how could they do that? Well, at the very basic level, they should be looking for more than just observations from their data teams. And they will have access to data teams internally and externally. They'll be looking for more than just a reputation score or a sentiment score or an evaluation of the media coverage for the past month. They should be looking for more than just observations from their market research teams, which is like, well, we're fine because we surveyed the regulatory community in Europe last year and it turns out we had a net positive score. Well, what does that mean? It means nothing. So let's start now at the very basic level to ask ourselves, okay, you have the data. So can you start please analysing the data in order to be able to identify and surface what we call the so what? What are the actionable insights, the strategic insights that you can evidence in this data that you can start using to promote conversations at C-suite level? And that is not a behaviour that is particularly common or normal in our world. I know it'll sound like a shock to people who are from very data-rich sort of disciplines within the organisation, and who are data scientists and the like, but it's actually true. And so that's where we want them to start. Now, once they start with that, they can then start going deeper and deeper and deeper into using metadata, exploring the opportunities that AI and generative AI offer them to be able to more quickly analyze and more accurately analyze that information set. But at the very basic level, it's actually just respecting it. And respecting it not as something that in a retrospective way kind of confirms that what you did last week was good, bad, or indifferent, but that actually becomes something that helps you plan for the future. And as I said earlier, gives you even the opportunity to begin to anticipate issues and develop a bit of a predictive capability.
That's fascinating. So because this is a greater podcast, I'm going to try and get some free consulting for our audience and ask you the unfair question. If we assume that the organizations you work with are large enough, they either have the ability to implement or interpret instrumentation of data, what are the quick wins coming from? If you had a menu of several types of data, where would you recommend them to start with? Like maybe a bucket of 3 or a bucket of 5 next, and then the next 3 best?
So I think the quickest of quick wins is to think about the way they, for example, access their media monitoring, which is like the most basic of functions within the corporate reputation space.
And a digitally native organization by now. Most
organizations. There are some amazing companies out there that have built platforms that do media monitoring, and they produce a report for you every day. And I guess our contention at Penta would be that these are incredible platforms. But by buying the services in from the platform, what is happening in the organization is you're consuming the media monitoring as a product. You're not having access to the data set from which the monitoring was drawn. What we've done in Penta is we've brought the platform into Penta. So we're not looking at media monitoring just as a product. Obviously, clients will want their media monitoring at 8 a.m. or 7 a.m. every morning, and they'll want to get a really nice email with, here are the 4 things you need to know about today, and they'll want it to be summarized and all that sort of stuff. And that's really important that that's done really well and to a very high standard. But I'm as interested in the data set that all came from as I am just in the media monitoring application. Because that data set is, a very large chunk of everything that was published in the world that day. And it's not just the stuff that was published in the world that day, but it's the stuff that was published in the world going back quite a few days, years. And so when we're sitting on that, as people who are entrusted with reputation management, the question I have for all of us is like, what else could we learn from that data set? How could we mine it? And I think the way we think about this is nearly like the iceberg. We just see the tip of it, and we've forgotten that there's all this other information lying below.
So you're getting early signals from the interaction of product with a customer.
There's really interesting applications that we've been able to prove just in the past few months that are fascinating. Like, for example, it sounds like a statement of the obvious, but most organizations you would think might want to know if there's a correlation between their reputation score, sentiment score, and their share price. Now, in order to be able to prove that, you need access to a big data set. So there's an application from your media monitoring data set already that very few people think of using.
That's very interesting.
The other one would be, if you're researching policymakers, we do primary research on policymakers, and that's very important. And, that involves sitting down and interviewing them with structured questionnaires like proper market research, is done. And that's expensive. Because if you've got 500 in Europe and 500 in the States that you have to interview each year, it's a fair chunk of cash just to get the research done. It's very important to do that. Don't get me wrong. But of course, we do it every year, and we're very proud of having a longitudinal study that goes every year. But at the end of the day, all we've done is ask them what they think about an issue on the first day of whatever month we did the research in year one. And then we've come back to them on the first day of whatever day we did the research in year two, and we asked them if their opinion has changed. What happened in the 364 days in between? So right now, unless you have essentially a bottomless fund to go out and do market research every week or every month, you basically don't know. So you're now relying on, we're back to the senior advisors, you're relying on the wisdom of the advisor to sort of speculate about what might be happening. Have things changed? Has there been any shift? Well, if you're sitting on a large metadata set, these people are putting out tweets every day, or X's, or whatever we call them this week. They're publishing press releases. They're standing up in Parliament if they're parliamentarians and making speeches. They're going on the media and doing interviews, or being quoted in the newspapers. They are, if they're government departments, they're putting out communiques and da 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 da. So we obviously have all that because we've scraped it for the media monitoring. So let's think about whether you can use that as a proxy for policymaker sentiment and track the stuff they've said public against what they said in the primary research. And the answer, of course, is of course you can. And it gives you, to a really high degree of accuracy, a sense of whether the opinions have shifted from whenever the primary research was done. Now, is that information valuable to an organization in a highly regulated global sector? Oh, yes. It's very valuable because it allows them to understand and appreciate, what that critical stakeholder group is saying or doing in between those annual surveys that are very important, that give it the deeper view. And those are just two really basic applications. And you would be amazed how little of this is going on.
How little of it. I think it's amazing and actually very heartening because I'm a pragmatic optimist, and when I used to be in a big four leading innovation for 6 countries for our largest clients. And the challenge with leveraging our big data and analytics team comes from that well-trotted out quote that the best time to start measuring data was yesterday, and if not, then today is also good enough, well, the best you can do. It's amazing to hear that data sets that exist already outside the organization can be analyzed to create value for the organization and the governance. And so that brings us then to, are we talking about the transformation of a company? Or are we talking about the transformation of how we govern and lead organizations?
Well, my selfish interest obviously is in the whole reputation side of it. But as we've been on this journey in Penta, we've realized that actually it could be really exciting what could happen in the next decade in terms of organizational change, in terms of the structure, the governance, the management of an organization. And we were lucky enough to be able to participate at the World Economic Forum in Davos at the beginning of the year. And we were thinking about, how we might get noticed at Davos, if I'm honest with you. And we decided to have a conversation, which our president, Matt McDonald, led, on the impact of AI in the C-suite. And obviously we think about it through reputational lens. But when we began to plan for this conversation with friends in Davos, we realized actually that AI could have quite a profound impact on the C-suite in the next few years. At the most obvious level, like, you know, AI won't take the CEO's job, but she or he may lose their job to someone who can use it better than them. In fact, I would say will lose their job to someone who can use it better than them. But what it would definitely do, I think, is flatten the organization. Because so much of the modern management structure in business is about the management of information flow. I mean, I've always found it hilarious that we, you know, in practically every discipline, we spend our lives, the first part of our career is becoming competent in something. And then the second part of our career is generally becoming experts in something, only to be promoted into management where we don't do that thing at all. And there is an assumption, I mean, there's a great phrase in consultancy, you know, great consultant, you know, a great manager not necessarily makes. There is an assumption that if you were great at doing a function, that you will be fantastic at leadership or management. And that is, of course, not true. And you know, executive education and the world's business schools have made a lot of money trying to turn people who are good, brilliant at their jobs into being great at managing people doing their jobs. And I'm not here to talk about that, but AI is likely to be able to supplant an awful lot of the information management needs of the enterprise. And it is likely to increase the number of direct reports senior leaders will have in the business because they will be able to manage more information and distill more information. And that will have the positive effect, in my humble opinion, of flattening the organization. But it comes with significant risk, right? Because you've just delegated a huge amount of your information management to something that isn't sentient.
It gives a whole new dimension to key man risk.
It does, and key technology risk.
And we're already seeing the beginnings of that with what we call the tech oligarchs, right? Being able now to dictate government policy with lawsuits, you know, between AI companies and public and non-public. Do you see that some of your research will actually become guidance for becoming a modern leader and expanding your worldview?
I've no idea, okay, is the honest answer to that question. But I am really curious about how, you know, the great business schools and academics around the world who think about organizational behavior and organizational structure will reflect on how AI will disrupt their world. And let me just give you the most practical example. Like, we know AI will lead to significant productivity gains in different parts of business, you know, whether it's its ability to read x-rays, which is really cool, I think. Because to me, that AI can read an x-ray more accurately than a human is not, to me, degrading the doctor. It is giving the doctor better information from which to accurately treat the human. And, you know, to follow that sort of imagination, I can't imagine AI ever nursing someone back to health. And when I think about our healthcare systems, I think about the contribution nurses make to our healthcare systems and to our recovery from particularly serious illness. We put them at the bottom of the pile, and the fact they're probably the most important link in the chain. They're the one that is absolutely not substitutable by some form of artificial intelligence. The ability of a man or woman to accompany someone through a very critical period of illness and to support them through that to a restoration of their health is a particularly human thing. It's an emotional thing as much as it is a scientific or medical thing. And great medicine, to me, is not just about, like, you know, the chemistry of or the science of medicine. It's about the vocation of the doctor. It's about the healer in the doctor. And AI won't replace that, but it will make reading the X-rays better. And like in our world, in the world of reputation management, AI is already doing a better job at search engine optimization than humans ever did. And there's an interesting piece of research just out by the London Business School recently that proves this. I mean, it's amazing. It just outperforms it spectacularly. And yes, that means that people who have been experts in SEO management will have to pivot their careers, but they will be thinking about the strategy of online engagement and positioning rather than the actual technical exercise of, programming websites so as they're more optimized.
Philosophically, that's a template to think about many other vocations, jobs, and industries. And I've currently chosen to be pursuing not just the automation of discrete tasks, or even what's a step better, the orchestration of skill chains of multiple discrete tasks and skills required to perform something better, but the actual autonomous workflow orchestration, where not only does an AI component help you do something better or faster or cheaper, and then help you do several of those in a row, but it helps you decide when to move on to the next, when not to move on to the next. That kind of workflow automation, that almost autonomous innovation, autonomous management, is also one of those elements where a huge amount of risk can emerge, because now we're not seeing the deliverables. We are seeing the deliverables, but we're not seeing how the deliverables are being created at exponential scale.
Yeah.
And we cannot simply just dive into the data. So it is whether the AI chains and the management flows are obfuscating the elements and the checkpoints and the stage gates that we somehow need to build in at exponential governance. And I think that's a fascinating, and I guess that's an observation and not a question, but the scale of that problem is probably quite dramatic. And that's where I think we are starting to form those concerns around artificial general intelligence, AGI, versus using marketing to write some blog posts.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, it begs the question of the human as the governor rather than the manager. I know, it's the difference, but if you're back at business school, right, and the difference between management and leadership, management is doing things right, leadership's doing the right things. It's using your judgment. It's making the decision that we continue to do the right things rather than just executing tasks correctly. And I think assuming that we can get AGI, AI, Gen AI, or any of the variations of AI technology to assume governance and leadership decisions or authority is a dangerous assumption. And if we were ever to allow it to go there, I think we'd be asking for trouble, right? But it can absolutely replace the management element. So then the human becomes the governor or controller rather than employed simply to be the manager.
I've heard it described by AI philosophers almost, that right now AI is not good at telling us what we should do, but they're definitely already better at how to do it and doing it. But with AGI, that first element now becomes, are we ascribing control to something that we cannot fully read into the black box of how it made that decision?
Yeah.
And so will we be using AI to monitor AI and get into a very interesting
and this is when we, back to where we started this conversation, we as a civilization, as a species, need to make some decisions about where we put the guardrails. And so this is why there is absolutely no question in my mind, and I don't think no question really anyone's mind who is interested in perpetuating the growth and prosperity of our civilization, that we must deeply regulate this, and that it will become one of the great debates of our generation, the how we regulate it and the where do we put the boundaries around it. And back to Davos, it was very encouraging to hear people like Sam Altman, speaking very openly about the fact that this only really works if it's regulated. This only works if it's within very specific control boundaries. And those control boundaries will have to happen at the transnational level, the global level, because that will be the conceptual kind of model, which will basically tell us tell humanity how we wish to relate and use and take advantage of this technology. But then it will trickle right down to the firm level. And again, it'll put a duty on boards of directors to think very differently about their duty, their fiduciary duty as directors and custodians of the firm. And I think that's another area where we really need to start at the business level, at the enterprise level, start really having a big conversation. It's like, how does governance adapt to an age where AI is present within the firm?
I can see that trade-off, right?
Yeah.
Efficiency, productivity, that economic imperative to use AI more and more, with the enhanced risk of possibly not knowing
who made the decision? Yeah.
Something stops being optimal.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, for the manager's duty is to deliver the efficiency and the productivity, and the manager's duty is to deliver the firm's strategy. If you think about it, like at the basic level, the board's duty is to make sure that the strategy is correct, because strategy is still the duty of the board. And the board's duty as well is to sign off the accounts every year. So the board has the ultimate responsibility for the well-being and sustainability of the firm. And I think in recent decades, we've seen a bit of the blurring of the line between boards and management, in terms of that governance, where governance sits and where does management end in governance.
And companies with AI CEOs.
And I think that will be one of the great debates as well of the next few years, will be how do we globally govern AI and its relationship with society, but then at the firm level, how do we govern AI and its relationship with the firm?
Reputation, love it or lose it. And in the interest, again, of our audience, that was very philosophical and very interesting to go to. Maybe you can also add a little, taking it back to the brass tacks, what type of organization would most benefit from the deepest expression of reputational risk management? Is there a stage of a life cycle? Is there a particular size, sector, industry, threat?
Well, I suppose the bigger you get, the more risk you are exposed to. So I suppose the simple answer to that question is, the larger you are as an organization, the more exposed you will be to reputational risk. And when you talk about size, it's size in terms of breadth and depth. So let's describe breadth as, say, for example, international expansion. So if you're operating in many different parts of the world, your reputational risk is going to be greater than if you're operating in one market. And then if you're operating deeply in a sector, so therefore you're a ubiquitous organization within a sector. So for example, I'm a monopoly supplier or a brand that happens to be also the brand that is used to describe the entire sector, then obviously there's much greater risk. But for the vast majority of organizations, I would say risk, reputational risk, particularly in this world of disintermediate information, is something everyone needs to take more seriously. We can prove correlation between reputation and share price. Our metadata set throws out correlation for nearly every organization we've been asked to look at it for. There is a relationship between an organization's reputation and their valuation. And metadata now allows you to prove or disprove that in a way that previously you would have had to rely on, as I said, episodic research, which you could dismiss on the basis that, that was taken the week after we had bad results, or that was taken the week after we happened to send someone in for a parliamentary inquiry. So it was bound to be negative that week, but it bounced back. And look at the sales. The sales were up, so it was all fine.
So on the downside, the relationship, the correlation, the causality could be quite clear. And on the growth side, that also seems quite intuitive, because marketing effectiveness studies by scientists like Binet and Field have shown that over a 3-year period, investments in brand, when run 50-50 with investments in marketing your product versus marketing your brand, have the optimal long-term impact on how effectively you can and cheaply you can acquire a customer. Yep. So does it work also for growth, like understanding where to sidestep a potential landmine? Do you think that can also trigger a new...
Well, I mean, whenever an organization is hit by a crisis, a disproportionate amount of senior time, C-suite time and energy is invested in dropping everything that it was doing that week to manage the crisis. And so, if you're in an organization in a highly regulated industry that is buffeted by events and I would argue, yes, there is a huge saving and opportunity cost in just getting ahead of these things.
I think it's a softball question. So if we just say that large companies need to care about it more because also they have the capabilities to address it and they have more to lose, I think that's a softball direction. What do we advise companies in maybe the 50, 100, 200 employee stage? What can they do to de-risk and perhaps also use this kind of information to accelerate growth? Because I think that also addresses the CEO who says, it's not going to happen to me, right? So if it doesn't show me new revenue, I'm not so concerned. Like, how do we talk to them?
I mean, at the SME level, right? Trading maybe at a national level or even within a large city, as you say, maybe with up to 100 employees, doing quite well. The business is probably chucking out a really lovely lifestyle for its owners or for a few senior executives, and it's providing great careers for that. Like, there's lots of things that an organization could be doing to think about mitigating risk from a reputational point of view. There's also a lot of ways in which they could use AI and Gen AI to help them do that, by the way. So the first thing is you should definitely know what those stakeholder groups are saying about you. So you should find a way of being able to keep your finger on the pulse of the 4 stakeholder groups I talked about: the investors, the owners, customers, the staff, and the regulatory community around you. And if you're a small organization, that's the job of the CEO, because you're probably not big enough to have a chief marketing officer, chief communications officer. So you need to add to the CEO list of things that person must do, she or he, every year, is make sure that we have our finger on the pulse of those 4 stakeholder groups. And she or he should be thinking about how the organization is relating to those 4 groups actively. There are very simple things. They should be setting KPIs for the people who lead those functions to be able to report back up any issues, particularly. And so you don't need, there's not, in an organization that size, you don't need a metadata set to stay on top of things. You just need to tell people what it is that needs to be surfaced always. So an adverse customer event needs to be surfaced always. An adverse investor event needs to be surfaced always. An unfortunate interaction with, a regulator needs to be surfaced always, not left siloed down there as something that wouldn't be of interest to the CEO. No. You want to stay on top of reputational risk, you've got to take an interest in the organization's reputation. You've got to own it. And then the next thing you could do is, of course, you could use Gen AI to help you do a lot of this. I mean, Gen AI will help you synthesize whatever information does come your way. Gen AI would help you analyze the media coverage you get, to track sentiment and do things like that. You can use the analytics from your website. The marketing team will have a whole load of data that they're using for marketing purposes. Well, you should be interested in looking at that data through a different lens, which is reputationally. And does it intersect with, for example, your Glassdoor score? And are you interested in your Glassdoor score? And do you check what's been said about the organization and have HR send you a report up every month? Or do you dismiss it as, oh, well, we had to make a few redundancies last month and there's bound to be people who are, upset about us? So at the very basic level, it is my humble assertion that a fundamental responsibility of every CEO, managing director, general manager of an SME is to be the custodian of that organization's reputation and to be its chief stakeholder officer and to understand what those 4 critical stakeholder groups think about it, the organization that is, and to understand how they're interacting with each other. And to put a management structure in place that allows she or he to do that.
There you have it, a compelling and very thorough demonstration of how we can address reputational risk, the tools that we have, the kinds of data that we look at, the stakeholders that we now have to broaden our lens. For many organizations, it will be a change in how broad we take our worldview that leads to governance and decision making. I have one last question, not sure if it's a curveball. Do you have any advice then, instead of managing downside risk, how we can use this kind of data to drive growth and acceleration for the companies with the reputation lever?
Oh, 100%. I mean, there is opportunity all around the enterprise. And great entrepreneurs are individuals who see that opportunity. It was there. The entrepreneur was just the individual who could see it. And in this era of data, in this era when we are collecting so much data, if you take an interest in it and you analyze it appropriately, you will surface opportunity. And so one of the things about like what we do is we do predictive analysis. And the reason we're able to do predictive analysis is not because we are like sciences or, you know, have an oracle out the back that we stole from some temple in Greece. It's not. It's because if you get a large enough data set and you look for the signals and you spend some time thinking about them, you will see the opportunity as well as the risk.
Unbelievable. Anything that we should have asked you that we didn't?
No, it was a real pleasure to come and chat with you guys. And I feel like we've covered so much ground and I've disappeared into my philosophizing, which I do apologize for.
That was amazing. I feel like we've gone around the world philosophically and with very key takeaways and actionable advice. Connell, thank you. That has been an absolute pleasure. And I'm sure our audience has really enjoyed the conversation. Is there a way you would like them to reach out to you or Penta Group?
You can follow us at pentagroup.co, co, not .com.co, or you can find me on LinkedIn or on other social media platforms, and you spell my name CONALLMCDEVITT.
Thank you, Conall. Again, it's been an absolute pleasure. I've been David Isaac Matthews on behalf of The Great Room, bringing you thought leaders and insightful advice and actionable takeaways on this podcast. An absolute pleasure. Have a great day, everybody. Thank you.
You've just listened to the Greater Encounters podcast. This episode was produced, recorded, and edited by the team behind The Great Room. The Great Room by Industrious is co-working inspired by hospitality. With locations worldwide spanning across APAC, North America, and Europe, it is recognized as one of America's 500 fastest growing companies by Inc. magazine. The Great Room offers hyper-flexible workspace solutions to support a variety of unique office needs. Through community events and experiences designed to cultivate connections and amplify professional learning and development, we change the way you feel about coming to work. Greater Business Club by The Great Room is a next-generation business club for leaders building leaders. We facilitate an ecosystem of learning, collaboration, connection, and giving back. For more information on The Great Room, or if you would like to join the Greater Business Club community, head over to www.thegreatroom.co.